Thank you so much for those very powerful comments. And so I would respond to Arudra's questions and also make some general comments on some of the issues that have been raised by both Gautam and Amir. So when I talk about, and that's, I thought, was a central question that Arudra raised about how I look at the Constituent Assembly debates, and also in the three regimes of citizenship that I talk about, there seems to be a kind of almost a linear trajectory and a rosy picture of what I call the transformative phase of citizenship. And see, there seems to be a constant and continuous degradation towards the contemporary period, where we have a notion of citizenship which seems to be opposed to the constitutional imaginary. Now, one of the things that I think about when I talk of the idea of the transformative itself, and I'm referring to what Gautam has written earlier, and also some of the literature on transformative constitutionalism that some of you are familiar with, is the fact that the idea of the transformative was about democratic conception of government itself. So if it was about a rupture that polity was making from a regime which was about governing without representation, the transformative was a moment where there was a rearticulation with the relationship with the past. So the idea of transformative in my framework is about that rupture, and is about the responsibility that seems to have driven the Constitution or expressed within the space of the Constituent Assembly, that there were certain responsibilities that the state had, and those were in the form of interventions that needed to be made to transform society itself. So there was a responsibility that the state was undertaking. So the idea of transformative is in that framework, and also in the framework of looking at citizenship as something that is positive and in action. As Amir mentioned towards the end, how do we look at citizenship itself, and Arudra's question about the future of citizenship. So in the idea of the transformative, citizenship is, as Pius Langa says in his work, it is about thinking about a future that needs to be accomplished. And then there is this metaphorical bridge that he talks about, on which people need to be present all the time in order for that, even when the future is uncertain, that future needs to be kept in mind, and people need to occupy the bridge in order for that future to be achieved. So that is the idea of transformative I've had. Now, in terms of, yes, it does present a rosy picture, whereas the Constituent Assembly debates themselves were talking about the different fault lines, and also the fact that the Constituent Assembly was meeting in a context of extreme violence, in a context where members of the Citizenship Assembly themselves felt insecure, and in a context which Vatsal Naresh says the assembly itself was experiencing what's called hot passions. So there is, how do you then, what are the ways in which the discussions within the Constituent Assembly proceed in order for those hot passions to be alleviated, and what are the mechanisms that the assembly would therefore evolve for alleviating those passions. And therefore, in the context of the debates on Constituent Assembly, some specific measures were adopted, which was in the sense of deferring a decision for a future, and that deference was in the form of looking at Article, placing the responsibility on the Parliament through Article 11 to make laws for the future. Now, making that law for the future was not in a vacuum, because as Gautam also pointed out, the Constituent Assembly was articulating principles. Now, if one was to look at how does one look at the Constitution itself? If one was to think of the Constitution as a higher order law which restrains government, but it also enables government. So there's a limit that it puts on government, but it also provides a framework within which government must function or government functions. And if one was to look at the Constitution in that way, the Constitution is a political document, because it is talking about the way in which public power functions. On the other hand, there could be a different kind of reading of the Constitution itself, which is, as Dworkin would say, a moral reading of the Constitution. A moral reading of the Constitution would require then to sequester what is the administrative apparatus of government from what are the guarantees that the Constitution puts in place in the form of different rights. And even then, even the administrative apparatus of the state, the form that the administrative apparatus of the state would take, would depend on or are determined by principles. So if you were to think about the debates in the parliament and why a parliamentary form of government was preferred and not a presidential form, that decision itself was based on certain principles that were expressed in the Constituent Assembly, the principles of accountability, principles of keeping the executive on the anvil, and also, as Nehru would say, this is something that we've chosen for ourselves, not because it's something that we are familiar with, but because we've made a choice for a parliamentary form of government. And therefore, even when we talk about administrative forms that the government takes and the forms that are prescribed in the Constitution, those themselves take shape because certain principles are articulated within the Constitution. So that's how I would respond to Arudra's question. What are these principles? And how do we read those principles in the Constituent Assembly debates and in the text of the Constitution itself? So the second question, again, in terms of the methodological question, again, how does one look at the period of transformative? And whereas I've not done that in this work and have focused on the contemporary assemblage or contemporary regime of citizenship, now in the 2010 book, I have looked at that period in detail. And I've looked at the different archival records of the citizenship section in the Home Department to look at precisely the ways in which citizenship issues were being addressed within the institutional matrix of the state, in a context where the institutions of the state were embryonic. They were not, even among the institutions, they were not sure who is going to decide this question of citizenship. And therefore, you had these different categories of the abducted woman, and these categories were being decided in the court. Or you had categories like alien women or Pakistani women marrying Indian men, and how would you then, in this context where people were migrating across borders, resolve questions of loyalty, resolve the question also of whether two persons in a family, a married couple, can have different nationalities, and would you therefore then, to ensure that the family has the same nationality, give the Pakistani woman citizenship? So those were some of the questions that were being through the, and this is something that was pretty much evident from the archival sources, the question of who decides the citizenship of a minor, and a minor who has who has not moved at all, whose father, for example, is in East Pakistan, and the mother has not shifted, and the minor is staying with the mother. How does one resolve the citizenship of, and how do these stories then become narratives of people crossing borders, and also questions of how a question of a dignity of the Hindu community is affronted because there are these women who are stigmatized, abducted, and are being then trafficked to Africa, and therefore there would be these gentlemen in Africa who would say that they are ready to marry these women even when they have they're happily married, they have a wife, and but to restore the dignity of the Hindu community, they would marry the abducted woman. So these are some of the maybe the granular details that are not present in this book, but they have been addressed earlier. And there is this other question that I thought was okay. All right. So this entire question of the bureaucratic apparatus of the state and citizenship, and whether when one looks at the question of citizenship being addressed in tribunals, and then there is this other question of citizenship that is being addressed through this exercise that encompasses an entire state, and that exercise requires an active participation of citizens, and active participation in a way where people come to the state as supplicants, with papers that the state may recognize or may not recognize. So there is then the question again of how do you look at these papers themselves? The question of papers that Amir raised. And it's again interesting, and I would then also connect it with the question of the transformative, and how people like, for example, Onit Shani has looked at the way in which people were relating with the text of the Constitution in a context they were still not citizens, but they were registering themselves actively onto the electoral roll, which was an enumeration exercise very different from other enumeration exercises like the Aadhaar, or now the linking of the Aadhaar with the electoral roll. So that exercise, which she says was about inculcating a democratic disposition among even those who were among the administrators who were not used to this kind of an exercise, and people who were presenting themselves as candidates for enumeration for an electoral roll. Now, when you look at that electoral roll and think about locating the electoral roll in the context of the updation of the NRC in Assam, the electoral roll assumes a different character altogether. And even the NRC of 1951 in Assam assumes a different character altogether. If you'd recall that the context in which the 1951 NRC was prepared in Assam, the state did not have the kind of apparatus that it has today in terms of encompassing an entire population, and the NRC was prepared in a context where the population was actually mobile, in the context of the violence that happened in the context in which both the census and the NRC were being prepared. Now, in this context, the electoral roll and the voter ID card take a different meaning altogether within the NRC. So the evidentiary paradigm within which an electoral EPIC card and the electoral roll is now placed, it reverses that relationship that you would expect a document to have. Now, if you are a citizen, you have certain documents, but now you need to accumulate those documents in order to present yourself as a citizen. But then even then, the voter ID card does not become proof unless it is placed in another evidentiary paradigm, which is that of an NRC. So some of these things about what these bureaucratic practices do, and how in specific cases these practices do tell us about the lives of people. So if you looked at some of the cases that I've discussed in the book, these cases tell us about experiences of women who migrate after marriage, and how the testimony of the panchayat secretary does not hold much ground, because that is something that is not proof in the sense that a document would be. So those are some of the things that I would say, and to Amir, of course, that the passionate appeal to citizenship of the future, and I think the entire protests against the CAA, and not just the Shaheen Bagh protests, but also protests that cropped up in other parts of the country. Shaheen Bagh, of course, became emblematic, in some ways, but the protests that happened elsewhere, and also protests in Assam which attracted police violence. So in Dibrugarh, for example, there was violence. So how do we think of these protests where there is a reconstitution of the public space, and then that public space also becomes threatened because the repressive power of the state can be unleashed in spaces where people make a claim for rights. And therefore I will end with saying that the idea of citizenship that I'm working with is not in terms of the Marshallian framework of status, but in terms of relationships. And I'm also trying to, and this is unfashionable these days, where no, when people talk about citizenship and the anthropological turn in citizenship that has happened in the past several years, no, they talk about relationships in terms of no situated understanding of citizenship, where you would be constantly talking about citizenship not in terms of norms, legal norms and principles, but the way in which people would be articulating their citizenship. But there is it's important that we bring the state back in and look at the law as something that is shaping and mediating relationships in a way that that changes the way in which we understand our relationship with the state. So that's why I'm doing an unfashionable political science, looking at law and looking at the state, and law as a function of the state, and also law is the way in which law spawns specific regimes of citizenship.